Set of slides, and we may be able to start the next set of slides today. Project 1 is due tomorrow, and again, you're building the PF component, the page file manager, based on file primitives. And then on top of that, you're building just the initial part of the RBFM that doesn't include the deletes and the updates. It just includes the inserts. And you know what a record is supposed to look like, and you know about the organization that you're supposed to have with respect to pages where you have the records and then the free space and then the slot directory. And warning, you do have to keep track of where the free space is, so you weren't told exactly how to do that, but you need to be able to figure that stuff out, and there were some tips provided for Project 1 in a Piazza posting. At this point, people are on Teams, and it is quite conceivable in some cases that Teams will change because of people who drop the course. So if there are people who are leaving, make sure your teammates know, or if there are people who need to change teams, make sure that you let me know as soon as possible, because there's at least one case where there's a team that's only one person, and I may see about adding another person to that team. We will be posting the solution to Project 1 on Friday morning. We will also be posting Project 2 on Friday morning. Just as information in advance, Project 2 will involve 2 or 3 things in it. It will be finishing up the record-based file manager, where you'll have to deal with inserts, not just inserts, but also updates and deletes. And you'll also have to deal with forwarding addresses, and I'll post a note that reminds you about forwarding addresses and gives you some help in being able to deal with them. You'll be dealing with a relation manager, and in particular, you'll have to deal with the representation of these system tables, these catalogs, and how those get used, and that'll be there. You have a choice as to whether or not you'll be using your Project 1 solution or our Project 1 solution going forward. If you use your Project 1 solution, then you'll be inheriting your bugs yet again in Project 2. So you may want to consider using our Project 1 solution, in which case you'll just be inheriting our bugs rather than your own, and we won't be deducting for our bugs. So your choice on that question.
Will your solution still use like the same format like you said that we should probably be using in class?
Our solution will correspond to approximately to what we said in class for records and also for the files. It'll be using the file primitives. We're not, there was a question that was out there on Piazza, are we asking you to have a page directory? No, what we've emphasized is that for Project 1, you're going to be taking advantage of the Unix primitives as opposed to doing the real stuff that people would be using in practice. So we're going to be doing what we asked you to use. We'll be doing the fseek and fopen and fsync and stuff like that for dealing with the big stuff, not trying to do what you would really do if you were really implementing a page-based system. We will be following the record-based format that we described. And again, that's going to be posted Friday morning together with Project 2. We're going to finish up this wonderful 5x5 matrix that we came moderately close to finishing last time. Just as a remember about terminology, B is the number of data pages, think of it as being the blocks that you have. R is the number of records per page. D is this boring time to read or write this pages. We're doing something stupid here because it would get too complicated if we were doing something serious. Actually, there are at least 2 stupid things that we're doing. Number 1, we're not bothering to keep track of whether or not some disk pages would be in memory already. We're going to make believe every time we have to touch a page reading or writing, it has to make it out to disk. And that's stupid because we do have buffers, we do have things in memory, but actually dealing with that gets kind of complicated. The other reason that it's stupid is that it is going to be important to count CPU time as well. And there is a fair amount of discussion of CPU time, which is out of date in various ways inside the textbook. It's out of date because this textbook was written because anybody had even used the term NUMA, much less, started seriously designing database systems for NUMA. So we're not talking about that. We're going over some formulas so you can understand what's involved, but they're not the real things you would use in practice. A term that is important is the fan out that you have inside your B tree for the fan out for a non-leaf page. How many kids do you have in the B tree? We're just counting the IOs. We're doing average stuff. And we got moderately far into this, but I do want to remind you about some important numbers that are involved. We're gonna assume that the size of a data entry, when it's not the actual record, remember in approaches 2 and 3, you store the search key, not to be confused with the primary key. You store the search key and the RID, or the search key and the RID list. And we'll assume that the size of a data entry is 1/10 the size of the record. So the size of what you get by combining in approach 2, the search key and an RID is 1/10 the size of the record. In practice, it won't be exactly 1/10. Have to throw in another parameter. It's just easy to use a fixed number, 1/10. If it's something else, then you have to play with that. So the size of an individual data entry is 1/10 the size of a record. And the total size, if there were no free space, of all the data entries would be 1/10 the total size of all the records if there were no free space, okay? In the case of the hash bucket, we'll assume, hash index, we'll assume we don't have any overflow buckets, that everything is inside the hash table with no overflow buckets. And we'll assume that 4/5 of the page is occupied. So there's still 1/5 free space inside these hash buckets. So they're 80% full, which means we have 1.25 times the amount of space we would have if everything was jammed together with no free space. If things are 4/5 full, then we have 5/4 as much space as what we would need if everything was jammed together. So the expansion factor is 1.25, 125%, 1.25. And so the total size of the hash table is going to be 1.25 the size of the hash table if everything was jammed together with no free space. Similarly, on the B tree, we're going to be assuming that the leaf pages are going to be 2/3 full, which actually frequently has been the case in practice. So again, we don't have everything jammed together. We have 1/3 of the space being empty. And so the expansion factor is going to be the inverse of 2/3, which is again 3/2 or 1.5. And so the total size of the leaf pages would be 1.5 times the space if there were no free space. Because that's the expansion factor. And 1.5 times the total size of the size if there were no free space just for the data entries is going to be the same as 1.5 times 0.1 times the size of the data records. Remember, the size of the data entries is, per the thing on top, 1/10 of the size of the records. So 1.5 times the total size of all data entries is the same as 1.5 times 1/10, 0.1, times the total size of the record. 1.5 times 0.1, last time I looked, is 0.15. And so the total size of the leaf pages is going to be 0.15 times the total size of all the records if there were no free space involved. Now, we're going to get to this lovely diagram, and we had gone through heaped, sorted, and clustered, looking at 5 operations, scanning through everything, looking for equality, looking for a value match exactly, looking for a range match, looking for the cost of an insert, looking for the cost of a delete. What I will point out, by the way, and I should point this out when we did clustered last time, is that in the case where there's exactly one match, and we're looking at an index on age and salary as an example, in the case where there's exactly one match, the thing that you see there for equality would be correct, again, with all the ugliness I've already talked about. There might be more than one match. There might be multiple people who have the same age and salary, in which case, as with a range search, you'd have to get all the pages for everybody that has the same age and salary. So there might be a whole bunch of people who are age 25 and make 100K. So you'd have to get all of them. So if there's more than one, you have to get all the matching pages. But again, with a clustered index, there's going to be only touching each page once. At most, you'll never have to revisit a page. The point about a clustering index is the order of the values in the index and the order of the data pages is the same. And now we're going to spend a little time talking about unclustered indexes and several interesting stupidities and optimizations on that line. Where we had stopped is we were talking about this funny formula in underscan. And I'll remind you that had 2 pieces to it. Understanding the formula is much easier if you understand the 2 pieces. One piece is to find things based on the index. We're gonna be scanning based on the index, which, as we'll again see, is a really dumb thing to do, but let's figure out what the formula is anyway. What does it mean to scan using the index? We've got this index on age and salary. We're gonna go using the index through all the age salary pairs and then getting the records that correspond to the RIDs where it approached you or approached them. So we're gonna walk through the index from the smallest age salary value, age is the major field, salary the minor field. We're gonna walk through the whole index. And so the cost that you see here to do the scan is the cost to walk through the index and the cost to get all the data records that correspond to the RIDs that are in the index. What is the cost to be able to walk through the entire index? Instead of counting it index and RID, let's just do the accounting by counting the cost to go through the entire index, all the leaves of the index. Okay? What's that cost gonna be? Well, how many blocks are there? The B is the total number of blocks you would have if there weren't any free space. But going back to, going back to this thing, the blow-up that you're gonna have is gonna be a factor of 0.15 times the size of all the records. B is the total size of all the records. So the size of the data entries, if there were no free space, would be 1/10 of B. But there is empty space, and so the total size that you have for the leaf pages of the B tree, where you don't have records, you have the data entries. B is the total number of records you would have if everything was jammed together. The reason we went through all of this stuff is it's going to be 1/10 times 0.15. The 1/10 because the data entries are 1/10 the size of the records, and the 1.5 because you have a blow up because the pages are only 2/3 full, and the inverse of 2/3 is 3/2 or 1.5. So the cost that we see over here of just walking through all the leaf pages of the index is going to be 0.15 times B pages, and each disk read is going to cost D. So it's 0.15 times B times D. That's one cost. Now what about the cost of getting the records? Remember our infinitely stupid assumption, which is that we're not going to bother with buffer space. We're going to assume that things aren't in the buffer. Again, it is quite possible. We had it in system R, it's in every single system now, to make some assumptions about the probability that things are in the buffer space. Takes these formulas and makes them way more complicated. So the assumption is every time we have to read a record from the disk, which we get by looking at the RID, we're walking through the leaves of the unclustered index. We get an RID, we get an RID, we get an RID. Walking through the entire leaves. An RID here, an RID there, here an RID, there an RID, everywhere an RID. We can't go through all the different RIDs, and every time in this stupid assumption, the page that we need, an RID is a page ID and a slot ID. Every time we get it, it's not there. So for every record, we're going to have to read things in. And so that's where this factor of R comes in. Basically, R times B is the total number of records. B is the number of blocks, R is the number of records in a block. Again, B is the total number of pages, R is the number of records inside the page. Every record that we're coming to, and they're going to be exactly R times B records. That's the number of records we have. B is the number of pages. If there were no free space, R is the number of records that can fit on a page. R times B is the total number of records. For every one of those suckers, we're going to have to read the thing in, multiplying by D, in this stupid assumption. You don't want the more complicated assumption. If you're having trouble with this, the dart throwing thing, assuming that, you've got a buffer around, gets way more complicated. So this is what the cost is. So let me tell you, again, several reasons why this is dumb. One of which is new and worth thinking about. Number one, you can always ignore the index. and just scan the whole relation. The thing that we have in row 1, column 1 of this, you could always just take BD costs and just scan the heat. BD is gonna be less than BDR. This is at least one record in the page less than or equal to. So this is gonna be ridiculously expensive. You're not gonna go ahead and do things this way. You'll just go to BD. So even, you know, the formula is off because again, you really will have buffers. But also, if the formula were right, you just go and use the BD and go ahead and do it. Let me mention another thing to you, which I'll be saying more about later, but I'd like you to think about now. The way that we're using an unclustered index is hugely pessimal. Pessimal is the opposite of optimal. Optimal, trying to get something which is really good. Pessimal, something which is really bad. Why is it dumb? Why is it pessimal? Well, we're touching every page for every record. What if I took the RIDs that I have inside the unclustered index, which I can get by looking at the leaves, and I sorted them by guess what? Page ID, the page number. Remember, an RID isn't an unstructured thing, it's structured. It's a page ID together with a slot ID. What if I went through all the leaves of the unclustered index and I said, I'm going to sort my RIDs by the page ID, by the page number, and then I'm going to access them? Well, it's still an unclustered index, and I had to walk through the unclustered index to get all the RIDs. But now that I've sorted them based on the page ID, I'm only going to be touching each page once. So I haven't changed it to a clustered index, but by taking the extra cost of doing the sort based on page ID, I'm never going to be touching a data page more than once. I do have to do the sort of the RIDs that I got out of the leaves of the unclustered index, but I don't touch any page more than once. Think about that. Sometimes in this class, people ask me, why don't you do that? And I'll say, great idea. I'm telling you, it's a better idea than using the unclustered index stupid one. Let's get to the equality thing. Anybody want to explain to me what's written there? The D, of course, is going to be the cost of getting a page. Why the 1 and why the log to the base f of 0.15b? Hint, it's the same kind of reason we had for the first box in that row. Part of it is the cost of getting records, and part of it is the cost of using the index. How many levels are there in the index? F or f over 2, I'm not going to worry about the constant stuff there. Why is the log to the base f of 0.15b there? Why is the 1 there? Not everybody at once, please. Part of it is the cost. Well, I'll give you the easy part first, then somebody can give me the hard part. Once, assuming that there's only one match, then I gotta go ahead and actually read the record. So I find the place in the B tree where the match is, if there is one. There might not be. But I found the place in the B tree where there is a match, and then once I've got the RID for it, I get the record. So assuming there's only one match, that's where the 1 comes from. If there were more than one match, I'd have to get all the matching records. But if we assume there's only one that's there. Yep.
So the whole tree would be 1.5b pages?
0.15b pages, yeah, because it's again, the 1.5 comes from the expansion, the 0.1 comes from the, data entries being 1/10 the size of the data record. So the leaves of the tree, it's going to be 0.15b, yep. And so what about the log to the base f?
Each non-leaf has f pages.
Yeah, the fan out on average is going to be f. It's actually between f over 2 and f. So whatever, it's within a constant factor. It's log to the base f. So it's log to the base f versus log to the base f over 2. Just it's a constant difference. So basically, the number of levels of the tree is log to the base f of the amount of stuff I have in the bottom of the tree. I've got Well, I've got 0.15B leaves. And so go down the tree. Assuming the top levels of the tree aren't in memory, they really will be, but if they weren't in memory, I'd have to go through log to the base F of 0.15B things I have to look at. So that's the number of the levels of the tree I have to look at. Again, if I were doing the surreal, I'd assume that, you know, the top 3 or 4 levels of the tree are actually in memory. But we're being dumb about this. But you got the idea? There's the cost of searching the tree to find the match for the equality, to find the leaf that tells me here's the value that corresponds to the search key. And then there's getting the data, that's the one. And as I indicated on the box above, if the equality gave me more than one person who had the same age and salary, then I'd have to look up all of them, so that would have to get thrown in. If there's only one, then this would be almost kind of sort of right. If there's more than one, I have to look at multiple. What about a range query? It's gonna be the same kind of thing we've done before with trees with the clustering. You find the low place for the range. You're looking for all the people with age, salary, you know, that age salary between this value and that salary. You know, where you know, age is between 20 and 25, let's say. So you find the left-hand thing for the search on the range, and then you keep going, assuming that it's a consecutive range. You keep going until you find something that's out of range, and then you stop. For example, I could look for everybody, because it's age and salary, I could look for everybody whose, you know, age is 20, and whose salary is more than 10K, up to somebody whose you know, age is 25 and salary is less than or equal to you know, 200K, and just take everybody in that range. And remember, you have to be careful about major fields and minor fields. We're going to be talking about searches with major fields and minor fields in detail soon, but I'll leave you the idea. Just if that's not clear, just think about it as age between 20 and 25. I find the 20, and then I march forward until I find somebody who doesn't satisfy the 25, and then I'm done. So the search is the same as for the equality search. Find the low order place on the range, and find all the matches until you stop. And it'll be consecutive index pages to be able to find things. But of course, the actual access to the data, because it's an unclustered index, I'm going to be marching, you know, I may be touching the same page more than once as I bounce around to actually touch the data in the range. With a clustering index, things are in order. With an unclustered index, the pages may be touched many times unless I do my sorting by page ID trick. Okay? For an insert, you find the place where it goes, same as kind of the search. And you read in the data page, that's 1 times D, and then you write out the data page for the inserted record data. That's another 1 times D, so it's search plus 2 times D to insert it in. What about delete? Same kind of thing. You find the record that you want to delete, which is a search plus actually deleting it, assuming it's there, of course. You have to read it, you have to write it. That's the 2D. Last one. Aren't you glad? Aren't you glad I'm not really doing the real stuff that corresponds to this these days? The unclustered index, hash index. And it's going to be a lot like what we did with the unclustered tree index, only there's a different fill factor, a different expansion factor. So to be able to do it, and this is going to be just as stupid as it was on the line above, if I was really using the whole hash index, I'd have to walk through the entire hash index. How many pages are there in the hash index? B times R is going to be the total number of records that I would have if there was no expansion for the actual data. B is the number of blocks that I have for the relation. R is the number of records that would fit in each block if it was jam full. Same as it was on the previous one, B times R, for the data. But I'm only storing data entries in my hash index, so it's going to be a factor of 1/10. Since the data entry is 1/10 the size of the record. And moreover, we're assuming that things are only 4/5 full, so there's going to be an expansion factor of 1.25. 1.25 times 0.1 is .0125. So it's gonna be BR is the total amount of blocks I would have, it is the total number of records that I'm gonna have. Because there would be B blocks if it was just the records, if it's records, not data entries. B is the number of blocks I would have, R is the number of records per block, BR is the total number of records. And that's gonna get the two factors in there, same as it did with the unclustered stuff. There's gonna be, what do I have to do to walk through this hash index completely? I'm walking through all the buckets. And there's also, what does it take to be able to get the records? The time, just as the 0.15 over here was what I had to do to be able to multiply the BR and then times D, sorry, 0.15 times BD is gonna be the number of pages that I had in the leaves of the unclustered index. And here it's gonna be 0.125 times B. And it get multiplied by D because of the, I'm always going out to this. So let's just say this again. B is gonna be the total number of blocks I would have if I have the records. That's gonna have to get multiplied by 1/10 because the data entries are 1/10 the size of the records. It's also gonna have to get multiplied by 1.25 because things are 80% full, 80% is 4/5, inverse is 5/4. So the expansion factor is 1.25. 1/10 times 1.25 is the 0.125. So that's gonna be the 0.125 times B is the number of blocks that I have inside the hash index itself. If I'm going to assume that the hash index is not inside memory, it probably will be, but we're assuming here it isn't, then that has to get multiplied by D. So that's where this 0.125 times BD comes from. What about the BD times R? It's the same idiotic assumption that we made up there, which is that every time I come to an RID, that the page is not going to be inside memory. So then I will have to be able to read the page, and so for every record, for every one of the records, and there are BR records, I'm going to have to go ahead and read the thing in. Is there a question? Okay, you first.
Can you remind me why data entries are 1/10 the size of records again?
Because we made an assumption. Remember, a data entry isn't going to be the full record. It's going to be some part of the record. We could have made the assumption that it's 1/20th. We could have made the assumption it's 1/8. We could have made the assumption that it's 1/50th. Or I could have thrown another variable into the sucker and had you deal with the algebra of that other variable. We're just making an example assumption to show you how the analysis goes.
Okay.
In practice, it is what it is.
Okay.
And we have to play with that, more complicated. Second question.
So I'm confused by why there's addition in this. I mean, if you go and find the record, wouldn't you just? Why isn't it 0.125 times BD times R?
There are two things that are involved. There's using the index and there's getting the records. And the same is also true on the line above. Using the index to be able to go ahead and be able to find all the records, I have to walk through all the hash buckets. And then once I have a particular record that's in a hash bucket, I gotta actually get the data. Using the index doesn't give me the record. If I want the entire record, I have to not only find all the RIDs, I need to be able to get all the records using the RIDs. That's where the addition. It's getting all the RIDs, and then for each RID, getting the records. Okay? For check for equality, this is one which actually works very nicely. Hashing is great for equality. Oh, before I leave this box, the same comment applies. There's no reason why I wouldn't just go ahead and ignore the hash index and just use the BD of walking through the entire heap without having to, do this terrible thing where I go through the hash index with a BD times R, where R is going to be greater than 1. I'm always better off using just going through the entire heap instead. Now, for equality, I use my hash index, and I just go ahead and I find the thing that ends up matching, the individual value. So basically, the two things I need to do are get the correct hash bucket, that's 1, and get the data, that's 2. 1 plus 1 is 2, each costs D. D is the cost of getting this block, that's why it's 2D. not two-dimensional, but two disk accesses in this stupid thing here. What about the cost of doing the range? Well, this is a case, and I'm just doing the same darn thing that's in the textbook. This is a case where we could have a detailed formula for what the range thing is gonna be, but basically what it comes down to is you might as well just go through the entire hash thing as opposed to, yeah, and so it's just the plain b.d. You just, the suggestion is just scan the entire hash. Scan the entire, file rather than actually using the hash table, which would make the value more. So that BDD there is just, use the heap search instead, which really should be over here and over there as well. What about inserting into the hash table? You gotta find the place where you're gonna insert it, so that's the search cost. And then you actually have to go ahead and read the data page and write the data page. So it's gonna be search plus 2D, so congratulations, we've gone 4-dimensional, it's 4D. 2D plus 2D is 4D. Basically, you read and write the hash bucket, you read and write the data page. That's that, and the same for delete. All right, so when you do delete, you gotta, read the hash bucket, change the hash bucket because you've deleted something, read the data page where it would go, and get rid of the thing on the data page. So that's it. Easy. Takes a whole lecture to go through this sucker. And again, we're talking about all the ways that it's limited as well as right. Questions before we thankfully move on from this thing? Okay.
Let's go.
Understanding a workload. You have optimization, which we're going to spend a lot of time on. Trying to figure out a good way to be able to execute queries. How do you figure out what indexes, hash and otherwise, hash, B-tree, etc. you want to have for the workload? You want to understand for each individual query, as well as insert updates and deletes, what are the relations it accesses, what's it going to use in the where clause, what's it going to use in your select, how selective are those conditions? We'll talk about some examples in a second. We'll spend a lot more detailed time on this later on in the course when we go through optimization. But you want to be able to figure out, if you have a really selective predicate, then maybe having an index on that would be a good thing to do. But then you do have the updates. And, the update involves a where condition too. So you have to figure out which things are updated. So an update is just like a query, only it changes stuff too. You have to figure out what gets, updated, what gets deleted, what gets inserted, how selective are the conditions, and what attributes are affected. Remember, with an update, you don't have to update all the indexes, just the indexes that involve the updated attributes. If I go ahead and I change somebody's name, an index on age and salary doesn't get affected. Just the indexes on the attributes that are changed. So index selection is a really interesting thing because it's great to have indexes to help you do your queries, and it's terrible to have index because they have to get updated. So, take a look at all the stuff we just talked about. Which things are in the search key? How can they be used? By the way, and also there's a question about, do you cluster your index? Which indexes do you cluster? We said unless you want to replicate the data, you can only have one clustered index at most, which is 0. But unless you want to replicate the data, you only can have clustering on one. Do you use hash indexes? Do you, use tree indexes? There are a whole bunch of different access paths you can use. There are even things like partial indexes where you index on some values that happen a lot, but not on others. There are all kinds of choices. You can't have a database conference without somebody talking about some new variation of an access path. We just, focused on the really important ones. A first question for you. Suppose that I have an index on age and I have an index on salary. And I have a query